Hello, this presentation is on the blood, and the information related to this presentation can be found in Chapter 15 of your textbook. The blood is a type of connective tissue. It's the only tissue in the body that is a fluid, but it is considered a tissue because it does contain living cells. The blood makes up about 8% of our body weight, which in an adult is about 5 to 6 liters. One of the most important functions of our blood is transportation. So our blood allows us to provide cells with everything they need, things like nutrients, oxygen, and can take away waste products as the result of cell metabolism. So once a cell does its job, it produces carbon dioxide and other waste products that have to be taken to a part of the body where we can get rid of it. The other important function of the blood is fluid regulation. So it keeps the amount of water in our body constant, as well as electrolytes, things like sodium, potassium, calcium, and it maintains the correct acid-base balance. And because blood contains a big proportion of water, it holds heat, and that allows us to move heat around the body into places that we need it. That's one of the reasons why in the winter time, if you start to get cold, your fingers and toes get whitish colored and they get colder than your core, and that's because your body shunts blood from your extremities towards your core organs in an attempt to keep those critical organs warm. Because the blood contains white blood cells, which are the cells that make up our immune system, our blood and the cells in it are important in protecting our body from infection by pathogens, things like bacteria, viruses, protozoa, etc. And because the blood contains platelets, then it provides a mechanism to prevent large amounts of blood loss. So if we get a hole in a blood vessel, we can make a little clot, and that can prevent excessive blood loss. If we took a proportion of blood and we put it in a centrifuge and spun it in a circular direction really fast, we could separate the blood into its components based on density. So the heavier components would sink to the bottom and the light components would be on the top, and that's what you see in this picture. So all the sort of yellowish fluid, that's the fluid part of blood that we call plasma. And all the stuff at the bottom are the solids that we call formed elements. And the formed elements are blood cells. And we have 3 main types of blood cells in blood. We have red blood cells, or erythrocytes. And in the bottom picture, the cell that looks kind of like a squished jelly-filled donut, that is a red blood cell. We have leukocytes, or white blood cells. So the cell that looks like a coconut timbit, that is a white blood cell. And thrombocytes, which produce platelets, which is a fragment of a cell, and that's what you see in the center in this bottom picture. If we take a look at plasma, a large proportion of plasma is water. Now, plasma makes up about 55% of our blood volume, and 90% of that is water. And as we discussed in the previous slide, water holds heat, and so that is what helps distribute heat throughout our body. The remaining 10% of plasma is made up of substances that are dissolved in that water. So that includes electrolytes, for example, sodium chloride, potassium, calcium. Nutrients that we have absorbed from our digestive tract dissolve in plasma, so glucose, fatty acids, amino acids, vitamins. Waste products that are produced by cells, such as urea and uric acid, dissolve in the plasma and will move through the plasma to the kidney, where our body can get rid of them there. Carbon dioxide is produced as a waste product by cells, and a small amount of carbon dioxide can be carried by the cells, but the majority of it, is dissolved in plasma. Plasma is capable of carrying a small amount of dissolved oxygen, but most of the oxygen that's carried in the blood is actually attached to a cell, so not dissolved in the plasma itself. Plasma contains hormones. It also contains other types of proteins that are important for body processes, so antibodies that are an important part of our immune system, clotting proteins that allow us to form blood clots, and so on. So this picture shows large contingent anyway. I don't think it's entirely complete, but most of the formed elements are blood cells that are found in our blood. So red blood cells, platelets, and a whole variety of different types of white blood cells. White blood cells are the basis of our body's immune system, and each different type of white blood cell has a different role or a different task in defending our body against invading pathogens like viruses and bacteria. And we're going to get more into the specific of white blood cells a little bit later in this particular presentation, but also in week 4 when we do the immune system. All blood cells are formed in red bone marrow. Now, bone marrow is found in all bones, in the cavities inside those bones, but we have 2 different types of bone marrow. We have red bone marrow, where blood cells are formed, and we've got yellow bone marrow, where is essentially a storage place for fat. Red bone marrow in adults is found in the flat bones of the skull. So on this skeleton where you see this red shading, that's all red bone marrow. In the pelvis, the ribs, the sternum, and the ends or epiphyses of the humerus, which is the upper arm bone, and the femur, which is the upper leg bone. All blood cells are formed from the same type of adult stem cell. And if you remember, a stem cell is a cell that hasn't decided what it wants to be when it grows up. When this stem cell is given the correct signal, it could become a red blood cell, it could become a platelet, or it could become a white blood cell, and any one of the different types of white blood cells. Once the blood cells have matured in the bone marrow, then they're discharged into the blood. The type of blood cell that is formed by that stem cell really depends upon the signal that that stem cell receives, and that signal is a particular type of hormone. For red blood cells, that hormone is secreted by the kidney, and it stimulates the production of red blood cells, and that hormone is called erythropoietin, and you should look that up in your textbook. There are 2 different hormones that stimulate the production of white blood cells and platelets, and those hormones are called colony-stimulating factor and interleukins. And again, please read that section in your textbook. We're going to spend a little time looking specifically at red blood cells, or erythrocytes. And red blood cells are the most numerous type of blood cells found in the blood, so they make up about 45% of our blood volume. They start life as a complete cell, including a cell with a nucleus, but then they lose their nuclei when they mature, and this allows them to actually do their job better, which is to carry oxygen. So it allows them to carry more oxygen. So their main function is to pick up oxygen in the lungs. So as the blood flows through the lungs, it picks up oxygen that we've breathed in from the environment. And then the oxygen is transported around to every single cell in our body, being carried by these red blood cells. And when the red blood cells get into the tissues, then they release the oxygen, and the oxygen flows out of the blood vessel and into the cells, into the tissue, and the cells take it up and use it to do its job. Red blood cells are also able to carry a very small amount of carbon dioxide, but their main function is really to carry oxygen. I would like you to look up in your textbook and find the answer to what is hematocrit. The lifespan of a red blood cell is about 120 days, and after that they became kind of worn and ragged, and so at this time they're filtered out of the circulation by the liver and the spleen, where they are broken down, and then we can reuse or recycle the iron that is in a part of those red blood cells to make new red blood cells. Just to give you an idea of how numerous these little cells are in our blood, in a tiny drop of blood there are about 5 million red blood cells. The reason that red blood cells are able to carry oxygen is because they contain a particular protein called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is made using iron. So this is why it's really important to have iron as a part of your diet. Without iron, you can't make hemoglobin, and without hemoglobin, then red blood cells can't carry oxygen. So this diagram shows you a hemoglobin molecule, and it shows you that each hemoglobin molecule can carry 4 oxygen molecules. So if you do a little bit of quick math, I don't know if this is a dating fun fact or not, but every single red blood cell contains about 250 million hemoglobin molecules. So it means that each red blood cell can carry over 1 billion oxygen molecules. When blood is oxygenated, meaning that it's saturated with oxygen, it's carrying the maximum amount of oxygen that it can, that makes the blood appear very bright, or what we call cherry red. And so blood that is contained in arteries, which is taking blood to tissues in the body, those vessels carry very bright cherry red blood. Blood that is in veins, which is carrying deoxygenated blood back to the heart. So those are vessels that are carrying blood where the cells have taken up oxygen and have discharged carbon dioxide. That blood is a darker red, which we call kind of wine colored. Normally, in our blood, in the arteries carrying oxygen to the tissues, our oxygen saturation is between 97 to 99% in a healthy individual. These beautiful pictures are pictures of red blood cells in the smallest vessels in our body, and those are called capillaries. And the capillaries are the vessels in which the red blood cells can actually deliver the oxygen to the surrounding tissues. They're so small that the red blood cells have to line up single file in order to squeeze through them, and their walls are extremely thin. So you can actually see in this picture here, this darker section is the nucleus of the cell that is making up this section of this capillary. So the capillaries are 1 cell thick, which means they're extremely thin, so oxygen that's attached to these red blood cells can easily go right through the wall of the blood vessel and then be supplied to those cells that are in the surrounding tissue. This picture here on the right is beautiful enough that I could put that up in my living room. It's spectacular. If the blood is not able to carry enough oxygen to the tissues, then we call that anemia. And if you think for a minute what you would feel, what types of symptoms that you would have if your tissues weren't getting enough oxygen, I think it makes sense that you could come up with what are some of the symptoms of anemia. These are also contained in your textbook. In general, we would see paleness, something that we call pallor, P-A-L-L-O-R. And that means a pale face, or pale nail beds, or pale mucous membranes such as underneath the eyes. Without oxygen, we tend to feel weak and tired, have shortness of breath, you'd be irritable, maybe fainting if it's more extreme. It can also cause our heart to work harder, so heart rate would increase, and we might feel short of breath. In extreme situations, there's an increased risk of heart attack and stroke if those organs aren't getting enough oxygen. There are 3 kind of main categories of general causes of anemia. So, meaning that 3 main reasons why our blood can't carry enough oxygen. So the first is that if we lose red blood cells, so if something either destroys them or we lose them because of heavy bleeding. Things that could destroy red blood cells include things like a bacterial infection, and you can see this on this slide. So this picture is where they've taken a drop of blood, they've put it on a microscope slide, and then are looking at it underneath the microscope. We can see this big cell here, that is a neutrophil, which is a specific type of white blood cell. In the cool world of hematology, cool hematologists call them segs because their nucleus is segmented. There's a little dating fun fact in case you're dating a hematologist. All of these other cells that are surrounding that white blood cell are red blood cells, but you can see that some of them are just fragments or are really distorted, and that's because they've been attacked by a bacterial infection. The other main reason is that we don't have enough red blood cells, not because we've lost them, but because not enough of them are being made. And that can be caused by a lack in the supply chain in terms of what's needed to make them. So for example, if we don't have enough iron, we can't make hemoglobin, which means we can't make red blood cells. So if we lose a lot of iron, so for example, things like slow bleeding, like gastrointestinal ulcers, certain types of cancers, or if we have a lack of iron in our diet, we call that iron deficiency anemia. The other thing is that in order to make red blood cells, we need folic acid and we need vitamin B12 as well. And in addition, in order to be able to get vitamin B12 from our diet, to absorb it in our digestive tract, we need something called intrinsic factor. So if we're missing intrinsic factor, we call that pernicious anemia. If we don't have enough stimulus to our stem cells to make red blood cells, that is, we don't have enough erythropoietin, so for example, there's something wrong with our kidney, then that can also cause us not to make enough red blood cells. Or it could be a problem with the bone marrow itself. So if somebody is undergoing chemotherapy or radiation or certain types of cancer that crowd out those red blood cells like leukemia, we call that aplastic anemia. The last main category of anemia is actually a genetic disorder. It's autosomal recessive. So it's a gene that's located on an autosomal chromosome, and it's a recessive gene. So a person needs to receive 2 of them in order to express or to have this particular disorder. And this gene produces a protein that causes abnormal hemoglobin to be produced. And the abnormal hemoglobin will actually change the shape of red blood cells, especially when there's a drop in oxygen in the blood. So for example, when somebody is exercising really hard, then the red blood cells will actually change shape and they become sickle-shaped, and you can see that in this animation. When they become sickle-shaped, they are not able to carry as much oxygen, which increases the oxygen crisis. They rupture more easily, so a person loses red blood cells, and they can also get stuck in those tiny capillaries. So remember the ones where red blood cells had to line up to squeeze through. When they're sickle-shaped, they don't squeeze through as well. They're not flexible, and so they get stuck, and that can cause a loss of blood flow to certain tissues, and that can cause extreme pain, particularly in the joints, and a loss of oxygen delivery to those particular organs. So that can be a very serious crisis that can occur. A person that has sickle cell anemia can reduce the frequency and severity of those crises by increasing their fluid intake. So normally a person would need to take in twice the normal amount. This improves the blood volume and therefore allows those sickle cells to move through the capillaries better. There is no cure at this particular time. Leukocytes, or white blood cells, make up about less than 1% of the blood volume, but they are extremely important because they form our immune system. So they defend our body against pathogens, so things like viruses, bacteria, other types of protozoa. They respond to chemicals that are leaked from damaged cells. And so if bacteria invade, they start to invade and attack cells. Those cells send out chemicals that tell our immune system that something has invaded and they need to respond. They're able to leave blood vessels to enter the tissue. I love this picture here. This is a white blood cell leaving a blood vessel to go to the site of emergency. It's a little cape there. I think I could draw that in on the picture. Of course, if we have a disorder of white blood cells, that's going to affect our immune system. If we have, take a look at a blood smear and we see more than the usual number of white blood cells, we can actually quantify that by counting the number of white blood cells in a particular area. If we have a higher than normal white blood cell count in our blood, we call that leukocytosis. And that could be because our immune system is responding to some sort of an infection. So if you have the flu or if you have a bacterial infection, then if we did an analysis, we would see that you would likely have a high white blood cell count. And that's because more white blood cells have been made in order to counteract that infection. Inflammation has the same reaction. Allergic reactions causes the same thing. So do things like cancer. There are also certain hereditary disorders that cause large numbers of white blood cells, or certain diseases like leukemia, and we'll talk about that briefly. A low white blood cell count means that if we took a look at the number of white blood cells in your blood, that they would be lower than normal, and we call that leukocytopenia. That can be caused by certain types of drugs, for example, steroids or certain types of chemotherapy drugs, or there are some autoimmune disorders where the immune system actually attacks and kills their own white blood cells, and that can also cause a low white blood cell count. So in general, when we're doing a blood analysis and we see a high white blood count, we look for an underlying cause like infection. When we see a low white blood cell count, the biggest concern is that there's not enough white blood cells to respond to something should it invade. And as a result, there's concern about the person's ability to get well after, getting a virus or a bacterial infection. Leukemia is a type of cancer of the blood or blood-forming organs, so specifically bone marrow, lymph nodes, and spleen. Just like other types of cancers, tumors, the underlying cause is that the cells lose control of cell division. So in this case, they're cells of the blood, so leukocytes. So white blood cells start to divide uncontrollably in the bone marrow. And so a person ends up with very huge numbers of white blood cells, but these white blood cells are not normal, just like cancer cells are not normal. They are abnormal. We know that just like with other cancers, that the underlying cause may be an abnormal stem cell. So recent research has shown that there are cancerous or mutated stem cells found in some types of leukemia. A little star here that there is an increased risk of leukemia for children with Down syndrome. One of the biggest problems with increased white blood cell counts with leukemia is that they crowd out other cells. So for example, we get huge numbers of white blood cells, but they crowd out red blood cells and platelets. Without red blood cells, that causes anemia. Without platelets, that reduces the person's ability to clot. And although there's an increased number of leukocytes or white blood cells, they are abnormal and actually don't respond to invading pathogens, so they're unable to fight infections. So we end up with a three-pronged problem: anemia, bleeding disorders, and on top of that, a suppressed immune system and an inability to fight infections that occur. The treatment for leukemia is radiation of the bone marrow and bone marrow transplants, chemotherapy, or other drugs that stop cell division. Okay, we're going to stop here and we'll finish this presentation in part 2.